Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And yeah, this is a little bit later than I wanted it to be. The Machine Gun Kelly review derailed a lot of my plans, even if it went over really well. But this was also a tough selection full of a lot of albums that gave me some very mixed opinions, and sadly a lot of disappointment. Well, might as well put this out of the way for good. Let's get on the pulse. So before we go any further, if you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be extremely grateful. Episodes like this, they rarely get a lot of traction. Let's hope that changes. But we got 6 projects on the docket. Let's first talk about, from Alex Cameron, Oxys music. Okay, so one of the elements that I really liked about Alex Cameron's Forced Witness in 2017 was that it was able to take the schmaltzy 80s MOR soft rock tones and pair with some terrific compositional and lyrical instincts. A deconstruction of overblown masculinity that could make it also legit fun. It's an absolute winner. But Miami Memory in 2019 highlighted how that was a formula that could potentially have a shelf life if you added a bit too much polish. And while I still dug the writing, I was concerned about how we might be able to follow it up, especially with the, let's say, mixed reviews I've seen for this, not helped by how Alex Cameron was the only producer here instead of keeping Jonathan Rado's veteran influence around. And yeah, I hate to start here, but the thin line between sounding charmingly seedy and just outright cheap was getting crossed before, but that added gloss on Oxy music pushes us straight into late 80s, early 90s infomercial territory. Everything just sounds so weedy and lacking in body, from the saxophones to every watery synth to the guitars to even Alex Cameron's vocal lead. And that's exasperating because overall the bass grooves, they're solid. The live drums, they sound pretty decent. The drum machines sound like ass, but okay, that happens. And Alex Cameron's solid melodic compositional instincts, they really help these hooks pop. But if you're hoping for any real punch or swagger, the album just feels way too frail to deliver it. Hell, Cameron himself does not feel like much of a presence here, where the backing vocals can sometimes even overpower him. I mean, if he's attempting to sound like he's woozy and stumbling through a bad Oxycontin high, I mean, it might be accurate, but I can't say it helps these songs stand out. Speaking of which, if we go back to Forced Witness, one of the sharpest characteristics of Alex Cameron's writing was how clever, self-assured, but also self-aware of the scene it was, which made the over-the-top machismo easier to satirize and, in some cases, revel in. But Oxy music has Cameron sounding the least sure of anything in his career, be it drug use and abuse, or how people contextualize it, an increasingly hostile online environment, and this creeping numbness that he can't quite shake, which makes most of the lurid details and over-the-top humor lose some of its punch and honestly feel a bit stale. And that's odd, because you would think, given the last 2 albums in the last couple of years, that Alex Cameron would have plenty of absurd material to lampoon and satirize. Best Life and the loneliness of trying to cultivate an online following, which, yeah, I certainly can feel. Sarah Joe and seeing one's family swayed by misinformation, they're probably the most targeted. But as a project, this seems to shrink away, lost in a haze and so many layers of irony that it can't make much of a coherent point. And nowhere is that more obvious than cancel culture, which seems to be trying to walk the line between showing some empathy for those who are unwittingly canceled and then mocking those who will subsequently bitch about cancel culture. And you know what? The one credit I will give Alex Cameron's writing is his sense of empathy, where despite the bravado, it persists even here to the addicts or the people caught within systems and vices of which they're losing control, as if they could have ever had it. But that's such an individualized focus and this lingering bleakness, especially on the closing title track, that shows an unwillingness to go bigger, and it leaves the album feeling very small and painfully underwhelming. And with songs like Hold the Line, it just gets painfully dumb. Yeah, I gotta be honest, this was a really big disappointment for me. Maybe a better mix might help more of these melodies pop a bit, but it showed a serious limit on Alex Cameron's knack for satire that I wish he'd been able to push a couple steps behind where he was once cutting the edge. It's not terrible, it's got its moments, it's frankly way catchier than you would expect, but it should have been way better. And on that subject, from Hurray for the Riff Raff, Life on Earth.
Blooming jasmine,
Let me not mince words. After Hurray for the Riff Raff dropped their excellent 2017 album, The Navigator, the buzz for this new album has been weird. I mean, forget the last album being a tough act to follow, and given that it's one of the best of the 2017, it was gonna be the case 5 years later. But between some positive but oddly mixed reviews and lukewarm buzz and the brand of nature punk for an artist who has danced across indie country, folk, singer-songwriter, and more, I did not have a clue what to expect with this. And alright, full disclosure, I was planning on tackling this album at least a month ago, but I've been struggling to get a proper handle on it for a while, because mostly like while The Navigator, it's sprawling and it's trying to do a lot, but where that album was able to wrangle a focused emotional core and some of the band's best hooks, this album has neither. Part of this I blame on a shift in producer to Brad Cook, who previously worked with Bon Iver and Waxahachie, but absolutely strips out any sense of rattling punk edge or momentum on an album that winds up kind of listless. But I'm also reminded a little bit of Amanda Shire's last album in 2018, or maybe Billy No Mates of all people, in a choice to lean on more flattened, glittery synths and obviously programmed drum machines to play off more live percussion that doesn't have anything close to the organic texture and winds up feeling way stiffer than it should. Now, that's not saying there aren't touches of organic texture that are appreciated, especially in the acoustic guitars on cuts like RHODODENDRON and SAGA, but they often feel lacking in groove, oddly muffled, and very poorly layered to pick up any fire. And unlike Billy No Mates, I'm not convinced the socio-political content has the teeth to really back it up. Going back to The Navigator, the power of that project came from Alinda Segarra being able to marry some very personal stakes to the scenes of gentrification and their messy relationship with their roots and their culture. And they're attempting something similar here, but it feels like it's on a much bigger scale, feeling targeted and harried post-breakup as they try to return to their roots and community in the natural world, trying to work towards progressive change from the ground up. But minus any sense of greater narrative, the scenes feel very fractured and abstracted at best, in order to build that personal connection that really was the anchor point of The Navigator, especially as Segarra remains a very impactful singer who can pull you in. And thus I wound up wishing that they had just stayed with some of the personal, wistful framing rather than trying to go for more social commentary. Cause then you get the immigration detention story, A Precious Cargo, that Segarra tries to deliver through an MIA-esque pseudo-rap that does not work at all. Good intentions that are just mired in flows that sound very detached, clumsy, and reminiscent of the 2000s new age scene that got ruthlessly commodified and landed no punches. Ask Lorde how that went last year when she tried to parody it. And look, that's not saying the album is bad. If the more ethereal touches work for you, Segarra's personality and a smattering of good songs will hold your attention, but even after 5 years, you can't put this alongside Palante and Hungry Ghost and tell me that it's on the same level of textural refinement or intensity. Cause it's not. It's a tough listen to get your head around regardless, and it may work better for other audiences, but man, this was frustrating. It should be way better than it is. Next up from Lil Durk, 7220.
You trippin', go get your gun. They droppin' locations, I'm getting it done. Fuck tweeting, we sliding, the feds come.
The good thing about album bombs on Billboard Breakdown is that it pretty much encompasses the entire project, that effectively makes it covering them here a lot easier. And again, man, I wish I liked this more. The general frustration that I've had with Lil Durk for years now is that for as expressive as he can be as a vocalist in both auto-tune crooning or rapping, it's been tough to find a through line in his content that feels all that coherent. Kind of like his flow in a lot of these songs, he's got a lot of these off-kilter slapdash moments where you're left wondering whether it was trying to draw attention to his fragile, overloaded experience, trying to balance street-level violence with newfound success, or just a lot of sloppiness alongside a lot of bargain barrel flexing and fucking that we have heard so many times before, especially from him. And in Lil Durk's case, whenever he's writing about women, he's pretty woefully bad about it. Yes, I include Difference Is with Summer Walker in this, especially compared to his more street-level commentary that feels a lot sharper and more lived in. I'm guessing it's a balancing act of both here, because it made all the more frustrating because the production is arguably some of the best that Lil Durk has ever had. Yeah, the piano and guitar-backed approach to trap and drill is getting overexposed, but the percussion is incredibly crisp, the electric guitars are a really nice touch, the mixes are very well balanced, although whatever happened with the vocal mixing on Federal Nightmares, and Lil Durk has the presence to command most of these songs, and it's just a shame that more of them don't feel like fully fleshed out tracks rather than two verses that might be stitched together without a tangible hook. Or maybe one that just does not stick. Again, there is a lot of slapdash roughness around the edges here, where you have to wonder whether or not Lil Durk's assembly line process to churning out albums year after year, mixtapes so damn fast that it's flooding the market and preventing more distinct, refined moments from rising out. And he's not the only one in the scene who does it. His current enemy right now, Youngboy Never Broke Again, does this all the time. Or you're just gonna get badly conceived experiments like Broadway Girls with Morgan Wallen that deserve no attention. But the flip side is that for as much as Lil Durk can speak well about street level activity, it also does drag you into the Youngboy beef, which has made this feel way too real, where it feels uncomfortably voyeuristic to watch the very real carnage then appropriated for entertainment, especially as it increasingly raises the question of whether or not Lil Durk will ever escape it despite his aspirations. And when you place Lil Durk in comparison with a lot of his peers, I'm sorry, he doesn't have the sharply defined stylism of a 21 Savage, the aspirational focus of Lil Baby, the knack for structure and pop crossover of a Polo G, or even the storytelling focus of the late King Von. I mean, he's a sharper presence than Kodak Black, Moneybagg Yo, or Youngboy, but is that really saying that much? If anything, this album is not bad, but it's coasting on production and Lil Durk as the voice, rather than showing more to raise his ceiling, which by the very end of this project felt very defined. And even saying that's worrisome, because again, that could push extremes of violence to keep the hype moving. I'm hoping I'm wrong, but after this album, I can't help but wonder. Next up from GAYLE, A Study of the Human Experience, Volume 1. Why do I get the weird impression that this was just getting completely ignored? I mean, GAYLE has a top 5 hit, or at least she did. Her debut EP should be attracting some attention, right? Well, I was at least curious to hear what the hell is here. And it's one of those cases where there's both more and a little bit less than you might be hoping, where I get the impression that GAYLE and her label aren't quite sure how to best position her sound yet, and the EP does feel compromised as a result. Kind of a shame, because there's a pretty solid baseline of talent here. GAYLE is not a powerhouse vocalist in pop rock, and her huskier delivery definitely has a lot of very obvious comparisons, but her writing style leans on the snide, frustrated, and in some moments deeply earnest, and a low-key, rougher style can work for that, especially as her vocal arrangements do tend to pick up a decent amount of swell. It certainly works in the writing for me, which is where I find a lot to like, the teenager yearning for real connections and mostly completely fumbling the execution, either through guys who are horny and then take advantage of her loneliness, or the assumptions that platonic relationships might mean more than they do, and then all manner of ironic deflection that is not satisfying her deeper longings. Easy with Blue to Tiger at Upsal is a great example of how that self-aware deflection might not be helping them. Yeah, it's teenage melodrama, but it gets the emotional power of that, and that's got a lot of moments. The problem is that the production feels way too polished and compromised to lean into the mess effectively, or give this project any sense of teeth. It's exasperating that while ABCDEFU probably has the best hook on the album, the writing is probably the weakest, and the multiple remixes expose how they, speaking that their label, they're still searching for the right sound to pair with her voice, which is the exact same compromise for the rest of the EP. When the angrier rock remix is right there, it would work fine. So when you got a pop rock mix where the bass grooves and the percussion are criminally underpowered, outside of when they just use the drum machines, and the guitars, they can pick up some distortion, but are never allowed to properly explode with any real fire, unfortunately, like a lot of modern pop rock, they tend to have a lot more texture than actual melodic tone. All this gives me the impression impression that while Atlantic was able to give GAYLE some initial momentum, they've got no clue on how to manage the follow-through. And for a teenager with some promise, that kinda sucks, especially as it didn't seem like this was attracting any attention. I'm not gonna call it great, for me it's just mostly decent, but you know what, I reckon her potential deserves a little bit more. And if you like this brand of 2000s pop rock, you might enjoy it. Give it a shot. Next up from ROSALÍA, MOTOMAMI.
Yo me transformo, me capto de drag queen, yo me transformo, lluvia de estrellas, yo me transformo, pasa de vuelta, yo me transformo, como sex siren, yo me transformo, me contradigo, yo me transformo, soy todas las cosas, yo me transformo.
Well, this has been long in coming. So full disclosure, I'm not normally the most comfortable covering foreign language albums in On the Pulse, mostly because of the deep concern I'm just gonna miss something in translation when I'm discussing content and themes. Full disclosure, that might happen here too. But at this point, given ROSALÍA's explosion of popularity, propelled most by her star-making 2018 album, El Malquer, I figured I needed to check out her material properly, and, well, after a more traditionally grounded flamenco debut that nevertheless did showcase some impressive, borderline freak folk intensity, El Malquer did reflect a more expansive and varied sound that actually wound up enjoying a solid bit. Not sure it would have properly worked for me in 2018, knowing myself, and some of the more restrained melodic tendencies and iffy production keeps me from loving it, but I can say for a sharp half-hour runtime, great little album. I recommend it. And thus for MOTOMAMI, okay, let me again start with the qualification that my lack of Spanish does hold me back from embracing the content as much and as directly as I would like. Given how much lyrics matter to my experience with art, it does dampen the emotional response I might have to the album, even if I'm able to get English translations. It kind of sucks, but I want to be honest about that. But even with that understanding, I still think MOTOMAMI is a bit of a downgrade, especially for ROSALÍA herself, as she tamps back on some of that fiery passion that used to charge her work so effectively. I've said before I've never fully quite loved her voice, but leaning towards more restrained sultriness or these odd splashes of auto-tune and chirpy pitch shifting feels like a step away from the intensity that made her presence so potent. Even if on the ballads like Como Un G and Hentai, they can sound genuinely beautiful. Even in the last case, the percussion stutters and ramps up, almost reminding me of a modern Arca song, even if it did come from the Neptunes. Not surprising given all their collaborations. And really KLK, which is probably still their best song. It's also hard to ignore how the production feels like more concessions have been made towards blocky, mainstream bachata and reggaeton, with the drum machines and very restrained samples passing for the melodies. Another factor of her sound that persisted from El Malquer that, I gotta admit, doesn't quite click for me. It's way more percussive than emphasizing a lot of flow, and even if that's part of the point, given how much this project will swerve in its sound, if you struggle to connect to any of the bangers on their own merits, or notice how short a lot of these songs feel, some of the experimentation might feel a little bit undercooked, or you might have heard something similar to it before, especially if you heard a lot of Arca. But again, the balance between the synthesized bangers and the more intimate moments, it's also part of the point. When you look at the content showcasing the balance between the divinely inspired and playful experimentation, and the more confessional, vulnerable, family-focused material, showcasing the capacity for both within a defiantly feminine experience. Which gets exasperating when a lot of the former defaults to a lot of braggadocious brand name flexing, which isn't remotely experimental, even within the context of this production. And sure, some of that flighty hedonism, it's also the point, but if the vibe doesn't click, well, it can leave you on the outside looking in, and that's been my general experience with a lot of ROSALÍA's sound. Hell, she cites MIA on Barbarian as a major influence, and there's a lot of parallels to how their material has never quite resonated for me. Not saying it's bad by any means, it's certainly got its catchier moments, and ROSALÍA is a passionate enough performer to pull me in more than I think MIA ever has, and this album is intriguing for that. It's certainly curious. But even acknowledging that a lot of this is not for me, it's hard to escape the feeling that for as much as the experimentation has been highlighted, might work a little bit less than everyone thinks. I don't know, just not as great as I wanted it to be. And finally, from Maren Morris, Humble Quest. It's It's odd that it feels like I've got a history with Maren Morris, if only because my opinion has swerved so many times with her music. I thought My Church was a great song, but most of the rest of Hero was mediocre at best, even if 80s Mercedes has warmed on me throughout the years. From there, it just became very easy not to care about Maren Morris, given her likely path out of country, and our second album, Girl, was also largely mediocre. But then came a remix of The Bones with Hosier that was shockingly good, as well as an EP of re-recordings produced by Dave Cobb that was legit great. And on that topic, later that year she stayed in country, joined the Highwomen, and they put out one of the best albums of 2019. I will give her that. Then came Chasing After You with her husband Ryan Hurd, another song I quite liked. And it left me thinking going into this album that for as confident and fully formed of a performer as Maren Morris has become, I really just wanted a consistently good solo project from her where a lot of that potential would fully coalesce. And to her credit, this might be the closest she's ever gotten to it. I don't think this is a great album, but it's probably the most I've liked a solo project from her, with a lot of that old potential on display. Granted, some of this might be my lingering issues that might just be characteristics of her sound that she's choosing to stick with. I have no idea why she continues with that live vocal mic where her sharper tones tend to cut through the most, where producer Greg Kurstin is going to rely more on reverb to give her presence rather than smooth out her edges. And speaking of Greg Kurstin, he's still has a bad habit of relying way more on percussion than centering the instrumental melody. He did this all throughout the 2010s and it got obnoxious. And while it can kind of work for slightly more blues rock and soul tones on a couple songs like Background Music and Nervous, the latter an oily stab that really needed someone like Jay Joyce to give it some firepower to match Morris's vocals, it can also prevent songs from feeling a little warmer or more friendly, most glaring on I Can't Love You Anymore with the fake hand clap and one of the most underpowered pedal steel tones I have heard in years. Might be a little bit better on the title track with a more driving groove, or some of the warmer acoustics on the Lullaby Hummingbird, but I'm sorry, it gets really damn clunky with Tall Guys. That reminds me of some of the worst songs from Niall Horan's debut album, where she was on a song that quite frankly, I might like more than most of this entire project. That's another problem. I'm not sure there is a song here that pops as strongly as My Church, or really any of the Highwomen material, despite Natalie Hemby slipping in a couple co-writing credits. But I think that's more of a compositional hang-up than any real lyrical issues, where I think that the writing has measurably improved. More than ever, across this album, you can really see the paradox of Maren Morris being a little bit more settled, married, having a child, but then more openly questioning herself and her inspirations, which becomes a lot of the meta text behind Circles Around This Town, the title track, Background Music, and especially that heartfelt tribute to her late producer Busby on What Would This World Do. But that juxtaposition also opts to stakes that feel a little bit smaller, which would work for an album called Humble Quest, but that's where that lack of warmth and a clunkier tone can feel a little bit misaligned, especially with Maren Morris as a singer, and this is not an album with much in the way of dramatic tension. Still, you know what, if it's the result of Maren Morris growing up and finding more of a comfort zone, the maturity does translate to a pretty good album. I've liked other stuff that she's done more, especially with the Highwomen, but she's on the right track with this. If you've been curious, give this a shot. But yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I would be extremely grateful. I know I'm ending on a more optimistic note, but I just know I pissed off so many people with stuff I said in this review. It happens. But hey, comment section's down there. Have fun. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get involved in my scheduling process, argue with me directly on my Discord, or hell, just support the channel, link to my Patreon right over there. You don't feel obligated, don't have to, but if you want to, options available. Till then, I'm Mark, you're watching On the Pulse on Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.